Good day everyone. We are the group 4 and for today we are going to discuss about the language planning and policy in the Philippines and other post-colonial or multilingual contexts. Hi everyone, I am Twinkle Salas and I am one of your discussants for today's topic entitled History of Language in the Philippines during the Spanish and Post-Colonialism. Let's read the overview. We have Spanish colonization, Philippines when the Spaniards arrived, language policies by the government in Spain, royal decrees issued by the government in Spain, the trend of the decrees, language policies by the colonial government, failure of the Spanish language education, Spanish loanwords, and examples of loanwords. So now let's start our discussions in during Spanish colonization. So, what was the language policy and planning like during the Spanish colonization? So, according to Rodriguez 2013, the Spanish crown issued several contradictory laws on language. Missionaries were asked to learn the vernacular but were then required to teach Spanish. The friars continued to learn the local languages for evangelization, which turned out to be a success based on Gonzales 2006. Thus, teaching remained limited for the elites and wealthy Filipinos ready to conform to Spanish colonial agendas based on Martin 1999. So, this was a way for the Spanish to control the country, and as Mahub and Cruz 2013 suggests, a means to divide the rich and the poor. Arguably, this can also be the reason why the Ilustrados or Filipinos educated in Spain supported Philippine independence. So it says here that during the Spanish colonization, there are inequality between the rich and the poor. Only the elites and wealthy Filipinos have an access to learn Spanish language, while missionaries were learned the vernacular, but they were then required to teach Spanish language. And when it comes in evangelizations, the friars are using local languages. So, in spite of repeated language instructions from the crown on teaching the natives the Spanish language, there was only a little compliance. Instead, the friars using common sense kept employing the local languages, so much that in the period of instant nationalism in the 19th century, the failure of the Spanish friars to teach Spanish was used by some of the ilustrados or Filipinos educated in Spain as a reason to accuse the friars of deliberately keeping Spanish away from the natives so as to prevent them from advancing themselves. Okay, Philippines when the Spaniards arrived. Philippines was originally inhabited by Malays before the Spaniards arrived here in our country. They formed a small city called Barangay along seacoast and riverside. They believed in primitive animism and led a subsistence life by farming or fishing. Around 15th century, the influence of Islam reached the southern parts of the Philippines, such as Mindanao and Sulu Islands, which are currently a stronghold of the Muslim religion. As for linguistic situations, inhabitants spoke languages of Malayo-Polynesian family. It seemed that more than several hundred languages were spoken, as is the same with the present day. Unfortunately, there remain so few historical documents that it's difficult to visualize the social-linguistic situations of the Asian societies. So one of a few data available was a book titled Relación de las Islas Filipinas, published in Rome in 1604. The author was a Spanish priest named Pedro Chirino. He states as follows: of all those languages, it was the Tagalog which most pleased me and which I most admired. I found in this language four qualities of the four greatest languages of the world: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Spanish. It has the obtuseness and obscurity of the Hebrew, the articles and distinctions in proper as well as in common nouns of the Greek, the fullness and elegance of the Latin, and the refinement, polish, and courtesy of the Spanish. And there is hardly a man, and much less a woman, who does not read and write in the letters used in the island of Manila. So, in this book, the price states that before the Spaniards arrived here in our country, Tagalog is such a beautiful language based on how the price described it. And there are other languages, not just the Tagalog, but not everyone can read and write the letters back then. And there's a lack of there's an unfortunately there's a lack of historical documents for that for our linguistic situations back then. So there is another valuable document descriptive of social linguistic situations of the islands. In 1609, Morga, a former governor of this colony, published Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas in Mexico City. In his book, he illustrated the lifestyle of the Filipino people and admired the languages as follows. So the inhabitants of the province of Manila, the Tagalogs, have their own language which is very rich and copious. By means of it, one can express elegantly whatever one wishes, and in many modes and manners. It is not difficult to learn or pronounce. The natives throughout the islands can write excellently with certain characters almost like the Greek or Arabic. So these two books indicated that Filipinos had possessed a writing system and most of the inhabitants had already known how to write and read, at least in the surrounding areas of Manila. They showed that there was already universal literacy by the 16th century and seemingly a civilized society. But some researchers, such as Corpus, express skepticism about the Chirino Morga assertion that there was a prevalence of writing system. In order to refute the assertion, showed various evidence which seems reasonable. So here we cannot afford to go into the problem whether this assertion was true or not. Simply we should pay an attention to the fact that in the 19th century, many Filipino patriots showed an interest in these passages of the books and found that there was once a great culture in this country which had been despised and regarded as a backward country. These two books provided many Filipino intelligence with confidence and pride in the motherland. So now let's jump in language policies by the government in Spain. So according to Constantino, there was the difference in the tactics of colonization between the Spaniards and other colonizing powers in Southeast Asia. In general, the Western powers initially instituted a system of indirect rule through the trading companies. Britain and Holland preserved the old ruling class and controlled the masses through them. Thus, the former ruling class was able to preserve their cultural tradition. When the Western powers started to implant direct rule in the 19th century, the level of culture of the colonized people was such that it could no longer be completely obliterated. Thus, there remains the consistency of history, culture, and literature. But in the Philippines, the Spanish authority controlled directly natives with an assistance of friars. No ruling class was allowed to be intermediary between the colonial master and the masses. In addition to that, friars stayed in villages and influenced the mentality of natives. They urged villagers' old practices and customers and systematically destroyed natives' religious literature or whatever smack of paganism. Thus, the identity of Malay people was totally wiped out in the Philippines. Royal decrees issued by the government in Spain. So in Spain, it was the Council of the Indies at Madrid that decided the law and involved the decision about the language policies until 1837. After 1837, it was the Ministry of the Colonies that issued the decrees concerning language policies. So in the Philippines, missionaries decided to use indigenous languages for propagating the Christian doctrine. But the Council of the Indies at Madrid insisted that missionaries should use Castilian because they were of the opinion that indigenous languages were inadequate to convey Christian ideas. So the government in Spain gave the colony many decrees concerning language policies. In general, these decrees can be categorized into two types. The first was to ask friars to learn indigenous languages. The Madrid government knew that the indigenous languages were indispensable for missionary activities through the experience in North and South America. The second was to ask the teaching of Spanish to natives. As the time went by, the developing industry and bureaucratic system needed the universal knowledge of Spanish. We will see important decrees chronologically and examine the significance of each decree. First, we have the decree in 1550. The earliest of the decrees concerning language policies was issued by Carlos I in Valladolid in 1550 on June 7 and reissued in July 17. So, three characteristics should be paid attention to in the decrees. First, the purpose of the Spanish teaching was mentioned only for the spread of the Christian doctrine. Here, language teaching was related to mainly religious purposes, not to nationalism or effectiveness of communication as often found in the modern times. Second, the decree was rather vague and inadequate for concrete policies such as financial considerations. Third, it upheld the idea that the sacristans were going to teach language. There was no idea of systematic language teaching by professionals, even though the teaching by sacristans was usually done in those days. We also have instructions in 1596. The King of Spain or Felipe II sent to Tello, the governor of the Philippine colony, an instruction which stated that the learning of indigenous languages by the friars was inadequate for missionary. Instead, the friars should teach Spanish to natives. These instructions was issued just after the occupation of the Philippines. The government in Spain began to realize the importance of Spanish, although they also understood the necessity of indigenous languages. In order to facilitate the transition from paganism to Christianity, they had encouraged the clergy to preach the faith using the native languages, but in the 16th century, it reversed its position as stated in the instructions to Governor Tello. So we have the decree in 1603. The above two decrees require the teaching of the Spanish language, but at the same time, the crown government demanded of friars to learn indigenous languages, probably because some of friars were reluctant or incompetent to master indigenous languages. So there were a small number of royal decrees which urged friars to learn native languages. Such decrees were not necessary in latter days because friars became willing to learn native languages. Evidently, they knew the importance of the knowledge of language and its advantage to their worldly success. Next, the decree in 1634. Felipe IV issued a decree demanding that the colonial government should teach Spanish to all the natives. So the previous decrees stated the Spanish teaching should be given to natives who were willing to learn, not to all the natives, unlike in this decree. The decree in 1686, Carlos II issued a decree in which he complained that former decrees issued in 1550, 1634, and 1636 had not been observed and stated there would be punishment if not observed. This decree is remarkable in that the authority enumerated, for the first time, unreligious concern as the purpose to teach Spanish. The decree was issued so that the natives might be able to complain directly to the authority. Usually, natives complained through the friars who were interpreters. From now on, they could communicate with the authority without friars' interpretation. It was no wonder that friars opposed or sabotaged this decree. Next one, we have the decree in 1792. A similar type of decree was issued by Carlos IV in which he evoked the previous decrees on May 10, 1770, November 28, 1772, November 24, 1774. This decree was more realistic than former decrees in that it mentioned clearly the financial sources, the type of desirable teachers, and the mandatory use of Spanish in the domestic affairs. It became closer to the modern language policies. So for the last part of my report, we have the trend of the decrees. The government in Spain repeatedly issued these decrees as regards language issues. As we have seen, The features of the decrees were gradually changing. At the first stage, the decrees asked both friars learning of indigenous languages and the teaching of Spanish to natives. Frey stated the primary purpose of teaching the Spanish language was the desire to spread Christianity. As time went by, the teaching of Spanish became more and more necessary because there is the diversity of the dialects which made an ineffective the training of the clergy in the Philippine languages, which became more numerous as conquest brought more territory of the islands under the Spanish rule. Then the necessity of language for administration came to be realized as Frey mentioned. The other consideration was the need of the state for a medium of promoting administrative matters. Political and social aspects took on increasing importance at least toward the end of the Spanish regime and held equal rank with the religious motive. So that's all my part. Thank you for listening. And for the next discussant, we have the Catherine Salcedo.